Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. Dragon's Dogma 2 is a highly anticipated sequel, even though the first game flew under the radar for a lot of people.
Strength in numbers, Arisen. This way, Arisen.
I was a huge fan of the first game, so naturally I was really excited for the sequel. After finishing my first playthrough, I can say for sure that Dragon's Dogma 2 is almost everything I wanted to see from a sequel. Almost.
You're a kind one, aren't you?
It has some massive improvements to features that were undercooked in the first game, but it also suffers from the same problems like the original. Despite all of the issues I have with the sequel, Dragon's Dogma 2 unscripted open world gameplay is just stellar, and I can see myself investing hundreds of hours into this game and still coming back for more. Unfortunately, Capcom implemented some bullshit microtransactions, which only made people mad. And instead of talking about the game itself, the drama around microtransactions took the main stage. The bottom line is, these microtransactions shouldn't exist, but Capcom has been doing this for almost all of their titles, so it was to be expected. On the other side, they truly don't mean anything, and I never felt like any features in the game are deliberately hampered in order to try and sell you some stupid item from the store. Anyway, here is my full review after finishing my first playthrough.
If you've an entry permit, an invitation, or proof of citizenship, present it now.
The game begins with a cutscene that shows the Arisen sitting on the throne, having fun and being cherished by the people from the capital city of Vermont. But something strange happens and the game turns into Elder Scrolls, basically. You start the game as a prisoner in the mine, but not before you get to make your custom character. This is hands down the best character creation system that I ever experienced in a game. You have all the tools to make a very unique looking character, which means you can create hideous monsters, super edgy anime characters, or even some famous characters from other games or movies. That being said, I personally never cared that much about in-depth character creation options because I easily get bored when making my character. And I would rather wear a cool helmet, which kinda beats the purpose of making a unique face, but that's just me. Come to think of it, it's kinda disappointing that the game doesn't have an option to hide the helmet, and I hope they will add this feature in future patches. Anyway, the story in the sequel had the potential to be amazing, but it suffers from the same problems like the first game. The beginning is very vague, but interesting.
The return of the Sovereign.
You play as the Arisen again, who is destined to slay the dragon and save the world. However, you have to prove that you're actually Arisen because somebody else is sitting on that throne. To be honest, the story never meant that much to me in the first game because the gameplay is obviously the main focus. Capcom tried to market Dragon's Dogma 2 as an RPG with a much bigger emphasis on the story this time around. And indeed, there is way more cutscenes and dialogue in the sequel, but don't expect a storytelling RPG. Well, technically, Dragon's Dogma 2 is a story-driven RPG, but the main focus is still very much on the gameplay. Just like the first game, everything in between the beginning and the ending of the story is very forgettable. Then the game kinda redeems itself with a great ending. Dragon's Dogma 2 expands the lore a bit, with introducing a new Beastren race along with their culture. I think stuff like this is way better than the main story itself because it adds some layers of depth to the game in general. You spend the majority of the main quest with the same character, who gives you quests related to proving yourself as the true Arisen. Some of those quests will introduce you to a couple of interesting characters. There are only a handful of memorable characters that I could name, but even those characters have very bland personalities.
By refining such crystals, anyone can attain the power of the Arisen.
I wish they focused a bit more on the characters instead of the main story. Listen, none of that matters if you ask me, because the gameplay in Dragon's Dogma 2 is very unique actually. You'll struggle to find a similar, unscripted action gameplay with an amazing open world. Let's start with the combat first. Dragon's Dogma 2 keeps the same philosophy for classes, or vocations as the game calls them. You get to choose a basic vocation that you like, but you'll be free to change vocations at the pawn guild. In order to get some unique and new vocations like the Trickster and Mystic Spear Hand, you first need to unlock them, usually by doing a quest. As soon as I unlocked a warrior vocation, I never looked back, but I want to replay the game with an archer first and probably Mystic Spear Hand later. When you gain experience, you also get discipline points, which you'll need for learning new abilities for your vocation. It's a system that works pretty well, and it's not that different compared to the first game. The base RPG stats you get from leveling are back, but this time around, I'm pretty sure they are fixed for the vocation. The first game would increase your stats based on the vocation, and when you switch vocations, the stats would remain the same. I'm pretty sure the sequel switches the base stats upon changing the vocation, which means that you don't have to min-max your build that much. You don't have any control over the base stats from leveling up. However, you can greatly impact your stats with the gear that you wear, and each and every vocation has unique items that you can buy or find in the open world. I focused on two-handed swords, but warrior can also carry two-handed axes and maces. The fundamentals of the combat certainly have notable differences, for better or for worse. Controlling my warrior definitely felt more clunky, but that's because the sequel tries to be a bit more realistic with animations. The first game had a more arcadey feel when it comes to movement and combat in general. For example, the jump was a lot higher, and your character will do a forward roll when he lands. The sequel nerfed the jump a lot, but the world itself is built around this new realistic approach to movements. It's kinda hard to get used to if you're coming straight from Dogma 1, but after a few hours it feels natural. Well, maybe natural is not the best word to use, since the movement can feel really sluggish and janky, especially with the warrior, who is a slower class by default. It takes forever to recover from the big attack, but you'll get some very nice abilities to offset this, like the shoulder tackle.
The attack has won. Strike fast and true, and our quarry shall fall. Easily done.
This ability is certainly influenced by Monster Hunter Greatsword moveset, and I like it even more because of that. I'm pretty sure that other vocations have an easier time with the movement in general, especially the Thief with the double jump or Mage with levitate. But that doesn't change the fact that the movement in the game feels completely different. The combat is usually all about the momentum, at least with the warrior. If you start losing the momentum, or you never had it in the first place, it can be very hard to recover. But once you get it, it's very hard to lose it, and you'll overpower the enemy with little to no issues. How you choose to organize your party of pawns can be crucial in fights. Warrior gets more abilities than in the first game, and most of them are extremely cool to use. You can slam smaller enemies against the walls, or even throw them off cliffs with this ability. Some of the old abilities are back as well. The class fantasy with the warrior with a huge sword is so great in this game without being too flashy or anime-like. Some people won't like that, but it's music to my ears. The sense of impact and the combat feedback in general is amazing.
Was most effective.
Jumping heavy attacks will also slam your enemies on the ground or land your character on the back of a huge monster. The physics engine in the game is one of the reasons why this works so well. Every single ability or movement skill will have a semi-realistic reaction to environment and enemies. For example, I can use the Heaven Sword Sunder, which sends your character in the air with a powerful attack. The way you land after this attack depends on the monster itself and the environment as well. This kind of combat system wouldn't be possible without a great AI behavior. All NPCs are completely aware of their environment all the time, even though the pawns will fall off cliffs sometimes, but still. This is the most impressive when it comes to the huge monsters like Cyclops, Trolls, Dragons and Griffins. But just in general as well, all NPCs have high awareness to what's happening around them. It's one of those things which makes the world feel very much alive. There's hardly anything more immersive than NPCs who are interacting with the environment in a very believable way.
Are you coming, Master? Our path is here.
It's very hard to pull off, but even the first game did a good job with this. The sequel took it to another level. A lot of enemy types from the first game are back, but there is a decent amount of new enemy types to fight. In many other RPGs, I would probably get bored of fighting these 10 enemy types over and over again, but Dragon's Dogma 2 unscripted gameplay and amazing combat system keeps it fun. The majority of RPGs would just stick to heavily scripted boss fights instead of going with a more sandbox approach. I mean, it makes sense because this kind of game design seems very hard to pull off properly. There are just far too many moving parts and a bunch of things can go wrong. However, this also creates some very funny moments which you'll probably remember a long time after you stop playing. Speaking of enemy types, the game adds some unique monsters to fight very late in the game, but I'll have to keep that for the spoiler section. When I got the grasp of my warrior, I enjoyed every second of this combat system. Heaven Ward's Thunder ability, which I mentioned before, is definitely a bit OP. Up to the point where I felt stupid if I'm not using it over and over again against most huge enemies. It can be hard to land sometimes, but if you combine it with the shoulder tackle, it's freaking amazing. The balancing of the game could be a lot better. If you keep upgrading your gear whenever you can, you won't have a lot of troubles against most monsters. There is only one global difficulty in the game, which is usually what I prefer. However, I would like to see a hard mode in future patches because I feel like the game was a bit easy if you're a veteran of Dragon's Dogma 1. That doesn't mean there are no challenging fights in the game, some of these monsters kicked my ass over and over again. Overall, I'm satisfied with the difficulty, but I would like to see an optional hard mode. And I'm kinda disappointed that the new Game Plus is not making the enemies tougher. Yeah, there is a new Game Plus which keeps all of your items and progress, it only resets the story and quest progression. But I would definitely like to see an option to increase the difficulty of the game, especially for the new Game Plus mode.
A smashing success!
Another big element of Dragon's Dogma gameplay is the ability to climb on big monsters. The sequel took the same concept and improved it in a lot of ways. Like I said before, the physics are really good in general, which also helps the climbing feature as well. It can feel a bit clunky, but it would be unrealistic to expect an extremely smooth climbing on raging monsters who flap their hands around like a gorilla. It's a miracle that climbing mechanics even work in such unscripted fights. There are no quick time events or gimmicky mechanics, which many games would probably have in these kind of situations. You need stamina for climbing monsters, your abilities and running around. But this time around you can even stand on enemies if it makes sense from the physics perspective, which allows you to regenerate your stamina. That's a huge improvement over the first game, and like I said, it makes sense. This might not seem like a huge deal to you, but I find this very impressive. I would gladly accept some jankiness if the core system works good, which it does in this case. But I didn't even mention the best parts. Now you can even use your actual abilities while climbing. Well, not actually while climbing, like I said, the physics have to make sense, so you need to stand on the monster, which can be hard sometimes. This can create some epic situations, especially with a warrior, if you manage to pull off a big attack on the monster. Overall, I think the combat system deserves all the praise in the world, and I don't see myself getting bored of it anytime soon. The stamina is a bit annoying outside of combat, because I don't see a reason to consume it while just exploring. Although the first game was a lot more annoying when it comes to this. The character progression in the game is very solid, and I did enjoy unlocking and trying out new abilities for the warrior. But like I said before, the balancing is not exactly great, and I didn't feel the need to use a lot of new abilities that I unlock. I think the game needs at least a couple of patches that will balance out the classes, but then again, the first game had some balancing issues as well, which never got resolved. I'm not saying the game should be perfectly balanced, after all, this is a single player RPG, and that could make it really boring actually. There are many different ways to play the game and make it more challenging for you if that's what you prefer. I wanna do a solo playthrough with a warrior, no pawns, just my main character, which will certainly make the game much more challenging.
Not a chance.
The visual progression is very good, and all classes have some very cool looking armors to buy or find. Every time I got a new weapon in the game, it felt like a massive upgrade. Some of the iconic armors and weapons from the first game are also in the sequel, which is great. The open world exploration in Dragon's Dogma 2 is stellar. There are only a handful of open world RPGs where I can completely get lost and immersed. Dragon's Dogma 2 is now one of them. To be honest, I didn't expect the sequel to improve this aspect of the game as much as it did, simply because the first game was okay at best when it comes to open world exploration. You're free to explore the world as soon as you finish the beginning segment, which is pretty short. The game does a great job with the introduction area and quests, which teaches you everything you need to know. Dragon's Dogma 2 has an impressive open world with very fun vertical exploration. This is something that the first game lacked. The open world in Dragon's Dogma had verticality and some cool areas to explore, but it was nothing amazing or special. To say that the sequel improved this aspect of the game would be a huge understatement. I am truly impressed with the exploration and the open world in this game. You will definitely miss things in your first playthrough, even if you focus on exploring everything you can. This open world is supposed to be 4 times bigger than the first game, but more importantly, it's 10 times more fun to explore. There are a handful of different looking biomes to explore, so the visual variety is not exactly amazing. But the map feels very realistic, while still having that great light fantasy vibe.
Words worth hearing.
Exploration is much more rewarding in the sequel. You'll find regular chests with useful items and unique chests that will always drop pieces of equipment. The way of getting to these chests is sometimes even more fun than looting them. And that speaks volume to the quality of exploration itself and the map design. I was also very impressed with the dungeon design. You'll find a lot of simple dungeons with just 1 or 2 paths to take, but they're always worth exploring. Then we have bigger dungeons with multiple paths to take and secret passages. Once again, how you get to some of these dungeons can be more fun than exploring the dungeon itself. I know it's a weird thing to say, but it makes perfect sense when you start playing the game. There were a lot of times when I thought I'm not going anywhere and I'm not supposed to be here at all, only to find out something interesting to explore. Capcom somehow managed to make these locations believable. They don't feel gamey or unrealistic like in many other RPGs, where the whole purpose of the dungeon is to be explored by the player. We can say the same thing about open areas as well. Having multiple ways to enter or exit a dungeon helps a lot with this design philosophy. The lack of loading screens also keeps the exploration way more immersive. Come to think of it, these locations are more like actual caves rather than dungeons. The open areas are even more impressive. There are only a few areas which are actually locked behind the main story progression, so you don't have major limits to exploration. When the night falls, it's almost like you're playing a completely different game. It's very dark and you won't be able to see much without a lantern. This is nothing new because the first game had the same feature as well, but it's even bigger this time around. You have to rest at the camp or at the inn because your max HP is constantly reducing. To be honest, I thought this mechanic is going to be a lot more tedious than it actually is. It's a minor inconvenience, but it makes sense in this open world with limited fast travel. Speaking of which, people try to make a connection with microtransactions and fast travel, which is totally brain dead if you ask me, and everyone who played the game will say the same. Again, I wish those stupid microtransactions wouldn't exist, but they definitely don't affect the fast travel in any shape or form. Items you need for fast traveling are expensive, but I never even bought one of them in the game, because I always had at least a couple of them by just exploring and doing quests. Not to mention that the endgame allows you to farm these items like crazy. You'll have over 20 fairy stones by just looting chests and killing monsters. If you like open world games with great exploration, you won't even want to use the fast travel. Unless you sometimes want to quickly jump into the city to turn in the quest or buy some new gear, upgrade the gear or rest. The backtracking in the first game was way more tedious, and I used fast travel a lot more in that game, even though the map was much smaller. So take that as you will.
Words worth hearing.
The last thing regarding exploration that I want to mention is the ability to enter houses and buildings. Populated places have a lot of buildings and houses that you can seamlessly enter and rob these people blind. However, there is a crime system, kinda. It's very basic and somewhat inconsistent, but you can get arrested. This open world would not be that impressive if not for the gameplay features like AI system and combat. The pawn system is back and it's much improved. You get to customize your main pawn, which is by your side all the time, and you can rent 2 other pawns from the rifts. The pawns that you rent are pawns from other players, which was a cool feature in 2012 and it's still cool today because it's still unique. You can even trade items with other players through the system if you want. There is a new feature which allows you to set up a quest for the pawn, and if other players complete it, you both get rewarded. I said it before and I'll say it again, the pawn system in general is almost like a genre-defining feature, but it seems very hard to pull off, so I doubt anyone else will try to replicate it. The AI in this game is simply brilliant. It can also be very goofy, but that's what makes some of the situations very memorable. The unpredictable nature of the pawn AI can be hilarious sometimes, but also very helpful. It's very easy to make memes on the expense of the system, but people can also take it for granted because of it. It's a brilliant AI system with insane depth. It's not just about the pawns, all NPCs have an amazing AI system, which is not a sentence I use a lot when it comes to most open world RPGs. In fact, most RPGs have a very simplistic AI behavior, especially in combat. So this feature in Dragon's Dogma deserves all the praise. Another thing I want to mention that's related to gameplay and the story, in a way, is the ability to resurrect dead enemies. There is a morgue in every major city in the game, and you can find some NPCs that died recently there. But it's not just about the morgue. If you have the wake stones, you can resurrect pretty much any NPC on site. I was really surprised that I could even use it on some important characters from the main story. Their reaction is sometimes very interesting, and the game just adapts seamlessly to this. Speaking of quests, you'll have some more decisions to make, which actually affects the outcome. The quests are usually very simple, but that doesn't mean they're not fun to do, simply because the gameplay itself is very fun. I like how the game won't overwhelm you with the number of quests you have to take, although this has to do more with how the quests are presented in the menu. You won't always know what exactly you need to do for a quest, and when you have some quest markers, they are usually very vague. This only further encourages exploration and looking around, trying to figure out what to do next, but it can also be annoying sometimes when you run in circles. Now let's talk a little bit about the visuals and the performance before we move on to the spoiler section. I think this game looks absolutely amazing in general, but unfortunately we still have a lot of performance issues on many PCs, not to mention the consoles. I received a PS5 review key one day before the game came out, and my plan was to do a full playthrough on the console. However, I found the performance on the PS5 terrible and almost unplayable for me, to be honest. And I'm not someone who can't play 30 FPS games, which by the way is totally embarrassing for a new PS5 game. There were a lot of situations where I felt like the game falls below 30 FPS, especially in cities. The variable FPS rate creates a very bad gameplay experience on PS5, so I just waited another day and bought the game on PC. That didn't entirely fix all the issues, although my game managed to run very well 80% of the time. The cities are the biggest problem because the game is very heavy on the CPU. I'm not surprised at all because we already talked about the complexity of the AI, but that's not an excuse for terrible performance. The character models look very good, although their facial animations are very basic, but who cares? The environments look amazing, there's not much to add to that discussion. Then we have the sound design, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it's very freaking good. From impactful sound effects for weapons and spells, to a great soundtrack that knows exactly when to play to boost your experience in combat.
Where this from? It has a means to control order. We cannot avoid
The voice acting is good, but nothing special, although there are some examples of very good voice acting.
'Tis a god's sway. Well, to be precise, the crystalline substance from which 'tis made.
Now let's talk a little bit about the spoilers, mainly for the gameplay. I'll give you some time to skip this section and go right to the conclusion if you wish. You still there? Good. Now, the story really ends on a high note, with a great cutscene and optional battle with Gligori, the same dragon from the first game. He kinda pops out of nowhere, but it was to be expected if you know a little bit about the first game. The battle itself is nothing special, unfortunately. But only when you roll the credits, that's when the post-game begins. A large part of the map gets destroyed by a cataclysmic event and there are new monsters to fight. Most of these fights are a lot more challenging compared to the base game, which was refreshing to see. It's a very similar concept to the first game, but it feels more open-ended and better in general. Even the old areas seem to get some stronger monsters from the base game, while the quote-unquote new area has some unique NPCs that you never fought before. The Headless Horseman is such a cool NPC, but very annoying to fight as a warrior. You can farm the rarest materials and items in the post-game a lot easier than before. Not to mention that you also get the most powerful gear from the enemies you kill. I think I read somewhere that the post-game time is limited, but I finished my playthrough by closing the last red portal. Now let's go back to the regular discussion and conclude this review.
When enraged, calamitous.
It would be a crime if Capcom doesn't have a big expansion for this game, or at least something similar to Bitter Black Isle DLC like in the first game. Bitter Black Isle was almost like you're playing another game because it has its own set of rules which are different from the main game. I really hope we get something similar, but I have a feeling we're going to see something much bigger than that. To conclude my review, Dragon's Dogma 2 is almost everything I wanted to see from this sequel. I mean, sure, it has some shortcomings and problems, and I try my best to talk about them in this review. But overall, I think this sequel is so much fun, and I can't remember the last time I played a new game and just forgot about the time in general. It's immersive, fun, and unpredictable, and I would highly recommend it to all action RPG fans. If you enjoyed the video, subscribing to the channel would mean a lot. And if you want to go a bit further than that, becoming a channel member or a Patreon would mean a lot. Many thanks to all of my current supporters, and I'll see you in the next one.